All right. Last talk for this block before we head into lunch. And we're going to be doing an interview with Shreya. Shreya is the co-founder and CEO of Partiful, the modern social events platform that makes it effortless to make plans in the real world. With millions of users across the US and around the world, Partiful has been recognized by Google as Best App of 2024 and Apple as its Editor's Choice Award, App of the Day, and a Cultural Impact Finalist for 2024. Prior to Partiful, Shreya held leadership roles building enterprise software at high-growth startups, and she holds a BA from Princeton University. Let's give Shreya a round of applause.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it to y'all. But I was doing a bunch of Googling about you before you got here, and I chatted with one of your employees. We got bagels last week, and I asked him for dirt. And he didn't share any dirt at all, so I'm going to have to drag it out of you myself.
Sure, go for it.
And I found a lot of information about you and your time at Partiful and the product, and so I don't want to focus on any of that today.
Sure.
I want to hear more about your journey from a student. You know, you got that BA at Princeton, you graduated, you got a job. What was that process like? You know, where did you go? How did you evaluate that? And then we'll see where we go into how we get you to the founder route. So I'd love to hear about your journey after you graduated and what that process was like.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Shai, for having me here. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I think that journey starts very much in college for me, because I think for a lot of people, college is where you start to think about what you want to do when you graduate, what you want to do with your career. And to be honest, I didn't have a really good understanding of that in college. At the time, and you know, Princeton's on the East Coast, this was like, I'm kind of dating myself, but this was like before tech really blew up in the way that it has today. And so it was a big thing on the West Coast in Silicon Valley. But when I went to school and where I went to school, if you were not a software engineer, which I was not, everyone would go into finance and consulting. And that was just like kind of the good job that you took, especially if you didn't know what you wanted to do, because they were pitched as very generalist careers. You could just learn a lot in general. And to be totally honest, I was also just partying a lot in college. So I was not one of those A+ students always thinking about what came next. I was like, this is gonna be the best time of my life and I'm gonna really make it. So I decided I didn't want to do finance. That sounded boring. So I was like, I guess I'll go into consulting. That was the thought process. I interned at a consulting firm the summer after my junior year, and then I did that thing where you try to make that junior year internship give you a full-time offer, and then you go back full-time. So that's what I did. And the main thing that I was orienting on at the time was just being in New York, because that's where all my friends were. So I would basically take any job that allowed me to be in New York. And so I worked at this tiny consulting firm. No one's ever heard of it. It has like 30 people. It's called First Manhattan Consulting Group. It's got a very generic name. And at the time, they just did financial services consulting. So it was consulting for like retail banks, like regional banks were our main clients. And I did that for a year. And the nice thing about that was I developed some pretty basic professional skills. I got really good at Excel and writing emails and putting decks together. And they were building an internal database of banking data, and I ended up like teaching myself SQL through that by just like copying and pasting queries and being like, okay, I guess this is how it works. And it like kind of reads like English, so you can start to understand it after a while. And then I probably would have stayed there like a very long time, except for the fact that the partners that I was working with ended up leaving that firm and trying to like recruit a bunch of us to go to this new firm, which created this opportunity for me to ask myself if that's what I wanted to keep doing. Meanwhile, I was terrified of getting fired because, again, the way consulting works is it's a partnership model. So you work for, especially at a small firm, a specific set of partners. And that's kind of your pod. And so if your partners leave, it's like your parents are gone and you're kind of an orphan in this firm. And as an orphan and with this whole schism at this consulting firm going on, I was terrified that I was on the chopping block as basically this new grad. So I was pretty desperate for a job. And I ended up getting a job at JP Morgan's corporate strategy group. Like that was a job offer that I had, and that seemed like a pretty safe and predictable path what they pitched to me was, you can come here, be an Excel monkey for a few years, go to Harvard Business School, we'll pay for you to do that, and then you can come back and be, excuse me, a vice president on like one of our teams. And so it was this career path that was very laid out for me. And then I had also gotten a LinkedIn outreach from a recruiter at Palantir, and she basically wouldn't tell me anything about the job or like what the company did, and I had never heard of it. But she's like, yeah, it's this cool tech company. You can come and you can solve all these like really big problems. They were talking a lot about these very consequential problems that seemed pretty interesting. And I basically kind of jumped into the job not really knowing what it was. I was like, what is the path I can take where I'm always gonna wonder what my life would be like if I took the other path, and then I'm gonna go take the other path. And so I just kind of jumped in.
Was that your main like evaluation criteria there when you were looking at the? I don't know if the offers, the timing was identical, or like where you actually got to make.
It was those two jobs I was deciding between.
Yeah, and so it was mostly just like, what is the weirder, like less like stable thing, I guess there.
Yeah, I was like, I'm young enough to take risks. This other path is so clearly charted for me, and I wasn't that excited about working at JP Morgan. And so I was like, I don't really understand what this thing is, but it seems like it's worth just taking a risk and taking a leap of faith.
Yeah, I want to touch on one thing you said earlier, and then we'll jump to your time at Palantir. You mentioned your manager leaving, your partner leaving, and I think that's a common experience that we all have to learn to deal with, and I will totally admit that I am terrible at it, right? Like usually if my manager is moving on, that's my indication it's time for me to go look for a new job. And I'm curious like what you felt during that process and how that experience led you to the decision of like, instead of going to Second Manhattan Consulting, which is what I'm assuming they called the new business, or staying and trying to work it out with a new manager. How did, what were you feeling there that led you to, okay, you know what, I'm gonna suck it up and I'm gonna deal with these horrible interviews again, like?
Yeah, I was so close to joining the other managers because when you're young and you're terrified about your job security, you just wanna cling to the thing that's really safe. And I actually credit a friend of mine at the time who was a few years older, like, I don't know, maybe like 5 years older than me, who took me aside and said, and he actually worked at this same company, he's like, you don't have to do this with your life. Look, what are the things that you're interested in? I actually, I briefly explored like working in fashion, and he like connected me with a friend of his that worked in fashion. I was like, maybe I go do that with my life. So I can't even credit myself. I think I needed like an older mentor to tell me it was gonna be okay and tell me that I could use this, I could operate not from a point of fear, but from a point of agency. And that was a super important intervention.
And I guess in that, were you like prioritizing yourself or the company? And speaking from experience here with my first job, I stayed there for 4 years. I stayed there for probably a little longer than I should have. And again, I had an older, luckily the founder was like, you are burned out. You need to do something else. Like, and they were really helpful in helping me recognize that. But, that first job, you tie your identity to it. It is who you are. Like, how did you have a similar experience with that where your job was your identity to some extent and like letting go was hard or?
Not with that first job, I think because it was, financial services consulting, and I was like, whatever. And I was still prioritizing a lot of the aspects of my life outside of work.
The partying, and
the party,
to know people in New York,
being 23 years old, 24 years old in New York is like a once in a lifetime experience. And so I was like, I want to do well in my career, and I definitely need a job, and I want to be successful, but I also know that this is a unique time in my life for all of the things that I care about outside of work, and so I wasn't like solely on my career as my identity train.
Yeah. But you said that job. Was there another job that eventually became your identity besides the co-founder?
Yeah, definitely the current one.
That one, being a founder, is a little different. Well, maybe we can jump ahead to Palantir, and like I would love to know again, like brief, like you were there, but like what was the thing that made you decide I need to do something else or come to that thought process?
Yeah. So the first couple years, so I was working on the private sector business. So I actually first started by working on this like operations team that was trying to solve internal problems, like how do we scale our recruiting, because the company was growing really fast at that time. And then I ended up getting put on some projects where Palantir was trying to grow its private sector business, and they put me on these teams that were building new products for hospitals and auto manufacturers and logistics companies. And the thing that I learned that I really liked about that was building something. It was my first exposure to product. I was like analytical, but I had no experience building software. And I got such a high from putting a smile on someone's face when I built something that made their life easier. And so, I was working with hospital workers who have very, very, very stressful jobs, as you can imagine. And when I was able to build something that allowed a hospital worker to go home early and see their kids because I had like streamlined a workflow for them, or a line worker at a manufacturing company, I was like, this feels really meaningful in terms of making this person's life better. But there are a lot of other things at the company that I didn't like. There was, a lot. It wasn't great from the perspective of like diversity. It had never had a female director, which I had a huge problem with. Some of the other work that the company was doing, I really didn't agree with, and so I was sort of being like pulled in these two directions of, I like the work that I'm doing day to day, but I don't really like a lot of the other things that are happening. And it got to a point where, like, 3 years later, I was like, I have to leave. And luckily, a friend of mine was working at an AI startup at the time, and I thought, this was in the pre-LLM era of AIs. This was back when he called it NLP and NLG, but it was still really interesting technology, and there was some really interesting research at the time that I was very intellectually interested in. And a friend of mine was working at this AI startup, and so it was like the perfect opportunity to shift gears and also move to a startup for the first time.
What was that experience like? So you jumped from a very traditional kind of consulting background into probably a huge company with Palantir, and then you're at a startup, right? Mm-hmm. And like how big was the startup at the time?
When I joined, it was 80 people.
Oh, wow, so bigger than your first job.
Yeah. But obviously a lot smaller than Palantir, which was like 2,000 people.
Yeah. How was swapping from probably a much more formal environment with your previous stuff into the chaos that is startups?
Yeah, it was actually, I think, it was a very well-funded startup, so I think it was a lot more organized than like a lot of the early kind of garage level chaos of coming in really at the ground floor. So it felt pretty buttoned up still, but I realized that I liked the intimacy a lot more. I liked knowing pretty much everyone that I worked with. I liked just being able to, if I needed to talk to a different team, just going over to a desk rather than being like, oh, that team's in California, you're gonna have to set up a meeting with them. And so that intimacy made it a lot easier to collaborate. And then there was also just so much more room to make a difference. Mm-hmm. Like my voice could just be heard much more easily in terms of decisions that the company was making because there were only 80 of us. And to be honest, what I realized there is like, even still, there's only so much you can shape that direction if you are just a rank and file employee, but it was a little better than what I had before.
Yeah. Is that what led into you deciding to start your own thing, or?
That was a big part of it. I think there were two things really. There was an awakening that I was having in my professional life and an awakening that I was having in my personal life.
Yeah, I was going to say, I want to hear more about that.
Yeah. So in my professional life, I was realizing that I had finally had enough data points about things I liked and I didn't like about a job to have a much more intentional sense of what my dream job would be. And I could write down a list of things that included. I wanted to work on a product I really cared about. I wanted to work on something where I could make individual people's lives better. Like a lot of I'd spent my entire career at that point in enterprise, working with giant enterprises, whether it was clients in a consulting firm or Fortune 500 companies at Palantir and then at this startup. And the thing that I really didn't like about that was I was trying to make a product better for an individual user, but the way that the company made money was by selling contracts to, the senior vice president of whatever, and that person had totally different incentives than the line worker that I was trying to help. And so I didn't like that lack of alignment there. So I was like, I think I want to work on something in the consumer space where the person deciding to use the product is the same as the person getting the benefit from the product. So that was a big part of it. And then I also wanted to create a company culture and way of operating that I hadn't seen. A company that valued diversity, a company that gave its employees a lot more of a say in what was being built, which was not something that I felt I had had. A company where, employees were treated with a lot more compassion, and where I really respected all the people that I worked with. And when I wrote down all of those bullets, and then the last requirement was it had to be in New York. Yeah. I was not going to go to the Bay Area. And when I wrote down all of those requirements, I was like, I don't think that job exists. I looked and I looked and I looked. And I wanted it to be a small company, so I realized I really preferred small companies. And it didn't exist. So I was like, well, it sucks to come to the conclusion that your dream job doesn't exist. Yeah. What do you do? So kind of left that there, but that was the thought process I was having over the course of many months. And then the thing that was happening in my personal life was a lot of my closest friends who I'd moved to New York with ended up leaving the city. And I was very, very lonely. And I realized that what I was going through was pretty similar to something a lot of people go through in their mid-20s, where you realize that most of your closest friends are from high school and college, and there aren't that many opportunities to make more of those friends as you get older. And it just gets harder and harder, right? People are busier. This is before most people even had kids and family responsibilities. And I couldn't see a way to solve that problem for myself, but it was a big problem. And as someone who, again, also really cared about my personal life, not just my professional life, I was like, guys, we got to do something about this. And luckily, those two things ended up coming together, where I realized that the thing that could be my personal mission would be to figure out a way to help not just me make friends, but to help everyone make friends. And that even though I didn't know quite what that looked like at the time, it was worth dedicating myself to. So I quit my job without much of a plan of, I'm going to start this company, it's going to look like this. I knew I wanted to start something to solve this problem, and I had some initial ideas of what that looked like, but it probably took a good 6 months of testing and tinkering before the idea for Partiful ended up emerging.
And you had a co-founder immediately right there?
No. I quit, and I was just this bipping and booping on a little island by myself. I was just working in coffee shops and trying to save money. I ended up coalescing around the idea for Partiful in the summer of, I think, 2019. Mm-hmm. And then I ended up meeting my co-founder, Joy, through mutual friends in the fall of 2019. Yeah.
I would love to hear a little bit about, so you took, the job at Palantir at the consulting agency and the startup with no intention of becoming a founder.
Yeah.
And being a founder is expensive. You have to pay your own bills. You have to pay Cobra, which used to be
expensive.
Health insurance used to be free. Yeah. Did you do anything in those last couple months before you quit to set yourself up for financial security, or set yourself a window of time to based on how much money you had, where you're okay, I have to make this work, or I have to go get a job again?
Yeah, I think mentally I had given myself a year, and I did have savings. Yeah. I think my parents are immigrants, and they came to this country and scrimped and saved, and I think a lot of that was baked into that. A lot of that was baked into the way I was raised and the way I thought about money. So my dad was the person being oh, you got this paycheck, now put half of it in savings. And so I was really good about that. And so I had about a year.
Yeah. Were they supportive of the I'm going to be doing my own thing and burning some of these savings, or?
I was so scared to tell them. I was so terrified because from the minute I had taken the Palantir job, they were kind of like, what are you doing? Like, again, if you have immigrant parents, you'll understand this, but like, JP Morgan is like every immigrant parent's like dream company. It's like
they
a
hear
blue
that
chip
and they're
company.
like, cool,
Yeah,
I can go brag about this.
They get to
You're
say
good.
at the parties, yeah, my kid, works at JP Morgan.
Yeah.
And then, like telling them like I didn't want to go to business school. I was like, how could you do that? Like both of my parents have advanced degrees. And for me my dad to have a PhD, my mom to have a master's, and then me to only have the silly old bachelor's degree, that's like the biggest failing to Indian parents.
Very relatable. My parents didn't stop asking about medical school until I was 30. So.
Yes, it makes sense because, they've worked so hard for you to achieve these milestones that they know are associated with economic stability, and they've sacrificed so much so that their children can have economic stability, so I completely understand. So I was really scared to tell them, and I was shocked that they were actually totally supportive.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's really great. Okay, last question for me, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Jumping into, you're now the founder of a company. You've transitioned, right, from this IC role where you're annoyed at people setting direction that you can't, set. You're annoyed at you used to be annoyed at managers, and you could go to your friends and complain about it. Now you're the manager, right? And your employees are probably feeling that way about you, and probably complaining to their friends about some decisions that you've made, and the way that everyone does, and you say you want to have a set of values that you're providing and a culture that you're providing. How do you balance? And then you're also responsible not only for your own economic security, you're responsible for their economic security and making sure their healthcare bills are paid, right? So suddenly, you're not just responsible for yourself, you're responsible for this huge set of things. How did you manage that transition? And what are some of the things that you felt as you were going through that?
Yeah, so the bet that Joy and I took, my co-founder and I, is that if we hire a small team of really smart people who we respect as equals, and we share with them all the information that we have about the constraints of the business and the opportunities of the business and the data that we're seeing, that they can reason through many of the same problems that we're grappling with just as well as us. And so we tell people pretty much everything that's going on at the company. We, have board meetings, and then the next day we tell the entire company what happened at the board meeting. And many of our employees say that Partiful is the most transparent place they've ever worked, because we think that the outcome of that is that we get really good ideas from everyone that the two of us might not have thought of. Now, there's a trade-off to that, which is that we ended up spending, because it's not as strong top-down decision making where we're like, we've decided this, now everyone's going to go do it. There's ways in which it slows us down because we can make decisions and then have to constantly be defending those decisions, and we'll go down a path and then someone has a problem with it and we have to be like, no, we've already set this direction.
We're past this argument.
So but that's the trade-off, and because so many good ideas and good adjustments to the plan come from that model, it's a trade-off that we're willing to take.
Have you found, I imagine there are limits to some of that transparency, right? I imagine you don't have a public spreadsheet of everyone's salaries.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Salary negotiation is a very emotional thing for people, and you can't be no, I'm paying you equitably. This is the same that the other person is.
There are companies that do that.
Yeah,
that's not us. Yeah.
How do you? So that's a period where it's emotions are really heated, right? And you've been on the other side of it, right? Where you're advocating for yourself, and now you're juggling. How do you balance those two things? And I imagine those are tough conversations for everyone.
Yeah. So we will be transparent about things at the company level, but that's very different than things that are about people individually.
You can't share HR stuff.
Yeah. So it's, I think we'll share everything that's company-wide that everyone needs to know that doesn't violate the personal privacy of anyone on the team. But when it comes to things like compensation and people's personal situations, I think everyone at our company understands that's just in a different bucket.
Has being on the other side of that made you evaluate previous experiences you've had with managers differently? When you've evaluated, or asked for salary negotiations and you haven't had that full window, now that you're on the side where you do have the full window.
Yeah.
Has that changed your view on anything in the past?
I think that the tough conversations that I had with managers in the past were never really about salary as much as about like, what are we doing? Are we building the right thing and stuff like that?
Yeah.
And so those ended up being more of where I was just like, okay, well, I understand that now being on the other side that there are more constraints than I thought there were. But frankly, for the most part, it makes me look back and be like, yeah, those managers could have done better.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I would love to open this up to the audience. If folks want to raise their hand, and Eric will bring around the microphone.
Great. Well, first of all, I love Partiful. Use it all the time.
Thank you.
Spend too much time coming up with clever, invites for people. But I guess I have like a two-pronged question. I think first, like when you think of a B2C brand, especially when like that's a product, like when you scale, you go to like a big box store, big distribution, et cetera. But for like a such a personal app like Partiful, like how do you think about scaling that as a business? And then when you do need institutional backing, right, to kind of scale your business as well, and like there's all of those conflicting interests, et cetera, like how do you keep that such like a one-to-one personal relationship with people as well?
Yeah, so I think when you think about the second part of the question, institutional backing, we're really lucky that our investors backed us because they want to just let us cook. Like they're like, you're doing something special here, and like we shouldn't get in the way of that, so we're just going to let you do what you're doing. So that part was a little more resolved. But I think the scaling challenges are similar to, like every company has their own flavor of scaling challenges. So it's not that one has more or less, and it's just that they're different. I think that a lot of the most interesting problems for any company to solve are the problems that haven't really been solved before. So we don't have all the answers to how do you preserve that intimacy as we scale, but we know that we have a team of incredibly talented and passionate folks who really care about this mission, who can take incremental steps every day to try to accomplish that.
Hello. So I was wondering if you could speak about how you said your company started in 2019, and you talk about how you coalesce around a business model about, I think I found something I can actually work with, and then tell me how COVID kiboshed your business model, and then how you had to reconstitute something and continue.
Yeah, I think a lot of it wasn't as thought through as all of that. I think the thing, I don't know how it is for other founders, but for me, the early phase of the company was like an act of desperation. I was like, this has to work because now I'm in too deep. I told everyone in my life that I'm doing this. I'm gonna look really stupid if it doesn't work. And I was feeling stupid every day. And I didn't know anything about, again, still wasn't in Silicon Valley, didn't know anything about like the norms of the space. I didn't know that building an app to help you and your friends hang out was like everyone's first startup idea. And a bunch of people had already tried that. Like I didn't know any of these things. And so I didn't have like a business model in the classical sense. I was just like, if I can create a reliable and relatively easy way that people can have more enriching social lives and meet cool new people and make friends through that process, then surely that's something everyone needs, right? Like that's such a fundamental human thing. And I was like, the market for that has got to be huge because this is solving a need that everyone has. And so that was the extent of like the business model level of the thinking. And so I was still like tinkering around, and then I joined forces with my co-founder officially in January of 2020, and then we went out to raise funding in March 2020, well, February, and then we closed it in March, and then literally like day one of trying to actually operationally work on the company, the world shut down. So COVID was really hard, but it was very hard for us, but it was way harder for the rest of the world. It was way harder for the people who were suffering and dying. And so, yes, it was really challenging for us, but I just contrast that so much with how bad it was for every other person. But we just kind of had to hunker down. We drew this hard line of, there were actually companies that were trying to do like underground parties during the pandemic, and we were not about that. We're like, we don't think that that's very ethical. But it also means that we can't test our product. And those of you who build products know that a product is only as good as, you know, the first person who uses it. And so if you're not getting user feedback, you have no idea if you're building the right thing or not. And so we waited like close to 18 months of just not really knowing, because we weren't able to just test at scale. There were these like limited pockets. Like, you know, we tried using the texting service for like Zoom parties, and we did a few other things. But it wasn't really until the world opened back up and we were able to safely give Partiful to all of our friends and have them use it that we really started seeing it take off.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your time, Shreya. I really appreciate it. We are going to be breaking for lunch for an hour. So be back here at 1:10. There's a ton of options around here. The market at 77 is within walking distance, and they have a bunch of stuff. We are also going to be running an unconference. So if there's any topics you're interested in, there's some paper in the back by where Tierney, one of our photographers, is. Go ahead and write your topic down, and then if you want to vote on one of those topics, there are these lovely gemstone stickers. You can go ahead and put like a gemstone on whatever topic you're excited about, and we'll be doing that on conference later in the session. So that's a wrap for now, and I'll see you all back here at 1:10. And thank you again, Shreya. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shai. Thanks, everyone.